The good thing is we're going to record this so that if folks come late, we've got a recording of this. Thank you so much, C, for recording. Hi, everybody. You're in the right place if you're here to find out more about what exactly is happening at the City Planning Commission in just about 9 days or so. That could radically change the way we think about affordable housing possibilities here in LA City. And excited that you all are here. Again, we're recording to make sure that folks who aren't able to make this call are able to catch up as well, and to share it with folks who might need to scrub on what votes they should be putting forth at the City Planning Commission as well. So we are hoping to share some of tonight's information exactly with the City Planning Commission. Anyway, my name is Godfrey Plata. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm the Deputy Director at LA Forward Institute, and I'm joined here with my partners at the Act LA Coalition, Marissa and Greg, who you'll be hearing from a little bit later. We are all a member of the Act LA Coalition. We're 40 plus organizations working primarily on housing and transit. And today, of course, we're thinking a lot about housing and land use. What we know to be true in LA City is that we have a history of racist and discriminatory land use practices that we've built our entire planning system on here in LA. It means that there's a lack of investment in tenant protections. It means that there's a lack of investment in affordable housing. And these are rooted, histories that we've rooted our laws in and our priorities in, and they've benefited primarily white homeowners in the midst of millions and millions of people living in Los Angeles who are trying to make this home. We know that it's creating traumas because of low wages, high costs of living, displacement, et cetera. All of the things that you see on your screen are things that we know to be true, and that's why we're involved in the organizations and communities that we're involved in. And so Act LA, all of its different organizations have been tracking a series of ordinances over the last year, but actually more years than that, of course. Basically, on the 26th, the City Planning Commission will have the opportunity to put forth possible solutions to incentivize affordable housing and protect tenants and renters at the same time. And they're going to send their recommendations to City Council. And so we want to make sure we are leveraging this opportunity at the City Planning Commission to make sure that what gets sent to the City Council are things that we would align with as community members who understand the truths that you see on your screen and the histories we just talked about. And so here's a little bit of a timeline of where we are in progress of possible tracking of these ordinances and possible taking of action. The City Planning Department has been engaged by Act LA and many of our groups for quite some time now. We've looked at a variety of different ordinances through them. They've done walkthroughs with us. We know some of us have done that in person or by Zoom, have shown up to commission meetings. And so a variety of ordinances have been drafted, including some updates that came in today, for example. And so some of what you are getting today literally came from today, things that came down from the City Planning Commission. In 9 days, the City Planning Commission, or City Planning Department rather, in 9 days, the City Planning Commission will be meeting very early in the morning, and we'll need our espresso to join them. And they'll be hearing from community about our demands, our reactions to the ordinances that are in front of them and what they send out to City Council. So it's really important that today we begin scrubbing up on what City Planning Commission will be receiving from these draft ordinances, what our reaction is as a coalition to them, and what can we do about that if we have particular reactions to push for more affordability, deeper affordability, more affordable housing incentives, more protections for renters in the midst of the development of affordable housing. These are all things that we imagine we can probably push for better outcomes for our communities. And the first opportunity right ahead of us is the City Planning Commission on the 26th. Of course, there are many opportunities you see beyond that. They're going to pass their recommendations to City Council, which means it'll first land at something called the Plum Committee. Plum stands for Planning Land Use Management. Right now, that committee is chaired by a council member of Council District 8, Marquise Harris Dawson. He's going to become the new president on Friday, and often there are switches in who sits on those committees. when a new council president is made. And so sometime in the next 1 to 2 months or so, we're going to see if there's any musical chairs that happens on that committee and who will be receiving the recommendations from the City Planning Commission. And so this is our first point of advocacy next Thursday, but it's certainly not our last. We will need to advocate at the committee, and then they will eventually send things to the full city council, all 15 folks. On LA City Council, and the city is mandated by state law to actually get these ordinances signed by February 12th. So there's a ticking clock for the city, and that means that there's a ticking clock for us and our advocacy for how we can best advocate for deeper affordability, better tenant protections, and more affordable housing for Angelenos across the board. Here's what we're doing today to make sure you are catching up on all the things that ACT LA has been plugged in on. We're going to start at the very beginning, which I think is a Sound of Music quote. What is the state actually requiring of us? We'll start there. Then we're going to see what LA City Planning has been working on, including up until today. And then we're going to share what ACT LA's reactions and recommendations are in reaction to what LA City Planning has been working on. Through all of this, of course, the point of all this is not just to get smarter and develop stronger perspectives, but also to get ready for action. And we're going to leave time for the end for any questions that have to do with any of this. If you would like to keep track of questions, you can put them in the chat box, and I can keep track of them and we can get back to them at the very end, just so you don't forget what your questions were. But again, this is what we're going to do, these sort of multiple chapters of learning before we get to our calls to action and Q&A. Cool. With that said, I think I'm passing things to my colleagues, Marissa and Greg at ACT LA.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that intro. Yeah, and like Godfrey said, a new version of the ordinances we're talking about today was just released by the planning department a few hours ago. The document is just over 2,000 pages long. We were going back and forth about whether we should just turn this into a live stream of a reading of the document and see if we could see how long that would take. But we decided to stick with our presentation with the caveat that we are still reviewing that document, and we'll try to flag where things may have changed or not. Okay, so zooming out, like Godfrey said, this process, these ordinances, they were spurred on by state law requirements. The state law has a legal framework called housing element law. It requires all cities to periodically adopt a planning document to sort of summarize the barriers to housing construction in their jurisdiction, the housing needs in their jurisdiction, among many other things. Part of the housing element is called an inventory of sites. The city looked at all of the land in the city of Los Angeles and figured out how much housing can we build on our existing land under our existing zoning. They used a complicated method to make that prediction. And they said, using all our land with the existing zoning, we can build, just over 230,000 units of housing. And it's possible that just over 70,000 of those units could be affordable based on the sort of densities that were allowed there. But the state also sets out a jurisdiction by jurisdiction housing needs assessment. So the housing needs assessment for the city of Los Angeles is quite a bit higher than the capacity that the city was able to identify on its inventory. And you may have heard this acronym RHNA, but it just stands, it's the Regional Housing Needs Assessment or Regional Housing Needs Allocation. The RHNA for the city of Los Angeles was just over 450,000 total units, and over 180,000 of those are supposed to be affordable. So there's a big gap there between what the city has identified as its current capacity and what the state and this regional body called SCAG has identified as sort of the needed capacity. So state housing element law requires that if there's a gap there, if you don't have the current zoning and the current sites to meet your housing need, you have to undertake a program to rezone sites so that you have more housing capacity. And that's where that February 12th deadline that Godfrey mentioned comes from. The state law says you didn't have enough sites. You've got you've got a certain amount of time to rezone those sites. And for the city of Los Angeles, that is by February 12th. The city needs to have adopted its complete its program to rezone and adopted new zoning ordinances to increase the capacity for housing significantly. The state law obligation is not just about building more housing, though. That rezone program also needs to what's called affirmatively further fair housing. So this needs to address patterns of segregation and improve housing opportunities for protected classes. So this is going to look like things like opening up new housing opportunities in historically exclusionary neighborhoods, and also figuring out how to turn areas that are lower income and maybe have concentrated segregation, how to turn those areas into areas of greater opportunity, which includes housing opportunity. The city is doing this rezoning through a couple of different ways. Some of it is happening through the community plan process, but a lot of it is happening through this citywide housing incentive program. And alongside that citywide housing incentive program is this resident protection ordinance. So those are the two ordinances we're going to be talking about most today, the CHIP and the RPO. And I think, okay, and so this is just a summary of the city saying, okay, our rezoning obligation, we're going to zone for an additional 255,000 housing units. Many of which of those need to be affordable.
Okay, so just a little bit of background before we get into some of the specifics. Greg sort of established for us like why, what rezoning is, why LA has to rezone in order to meet our housing goals or our housing needs. As part of this rezoning process, the city planning department has produced 4 total ordinances. But we have identified 2 of them, which are called the CHIP and the RPO, as having the biggest impact. And so these are the ones that we are focusing on. So those acronyms, CHIP and RPO, we are going to use over and over again. CHIP stands for Citywide Housing Incentive Program, and RPO is the Renter Protections Ordinance. So in short, just for a bit of sort of assessment of like why do these ordinances exist? What's the main purpose of each of them? The CHIP is, like in the name, an incentive program. And it's an incentive program to create affordable housing. So in short, if a developer receives the CHIP incentive, they will get benefits that developers like. So they'll get things like streamlining, which makes their buildings, their projects faster to build. It makes them easier to build. They can get lower parking requirements, which also saves them time and money. They can get the ability to build increased density, effectively more units. So these are all things that developers like. These are all things that lead developers to want to use an incentive like CHIP. And then sort of in exchange, what we get from that is that the developers have to set aside a certain percentage of units in each building as affordable. So those are designated affordable units. And so this is a way that the city can exert influence even over private developers and sort of shape what new construction looks like. And then on the other hand, the Renter Protections Ordinance is not as construction focused. It outlines the policies, it outlines the different rights that tenants have with regard to developers and where they live. So, while the city is doing all this rezoning and generating significant new construction, the RPO is there to kind of provide a safeguard for residents and make sure that they have their basic rights, especially if they're being displaced or if their building is being demolished. We can go to the next slide. And then we're about to get into sort of, the specific technical changes that we do think need to be made in each of these ordinances, but I'll broadly categorize sort of, you know, why are we engaging so much? Why do we think that as written, the CHIP and the RPO are problematic? And of course, like Greg mentioned, also useful to preface that up until now, we've been working off the draft ordinances that you can find on City Planning's website. They came out in June. And so that was sort of the existing draft until today. And today, City Planning reshared those with some changes. The full document is about 2,000 pages. So it's very lengthy. We're still making our way through it. And, you know, based on our very preliminary look at the updates, we would say there are some positive changes that we support. But overall, I think it's fair to say that the concerns we're going to express still stand. And we'll still be pushing for these same things. We think there's a lot of room in between the current drafts and what we need to see in order to protect tenants. So broadly, you know, what we're pushing for, affirmatively furthering fair housing, AFFH. Part of what this sort of informs the city to do is to take meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities. So as written, the CHIP and the RPO are not up to this task. In terms of the RPO, there's not enough responsibility that falls on developers to mitigate the harms for displacing tenants. And enforcement of protections through LAHD remains a concern. And then on the development side, when we talk about CHIP, these ordinances rely too heavily on moderate income housing, which remains to be out of reach for most people who live in Los Angeles. And it does not lean enough on deeply affordable housing. So across the board, we are using AFFH as a standard. We're looking at those obligations and pushing for the changes we would need to make to incentivize really affordable housing, including in historically exclusionary neighborhoods. And yeah, with that, I'll pass it back to Greg to start getting into some of the like technical specifics of the RPO.
All right, thanks. Okay, so we're just going to go through some of our sort of high level recommendations that Act LA has put together in response to these draft ordinances. We've got a longer letter that's probably linked somewhere that we could provide that goes into more detail. But this will be the summary. And right off the bat here, I want to flag that actually some of the stuff on this slide seems to have been changed significantly in the current draft for the better. Let me just go through these points, but I think that actually many of these things may be quite a bit better in the draft that was released today. So, but just so everyone knows, like these are like what we think are the important points here. We want the RPO to really robustly implement new state law requirements around relocation assistance for displaced tenants, a replacement obligation when existing units are destroyed, enforcing a right to remain so that tenants can remain in their units up until no more than 6 months before new construction starts. So, you know, so tenants aren't evicted earlier, and a right to return. So return, if a tenant is evicted for new development, they have a low-income tenant is evicted from new development, they have a right to return to the old property once the construction is complete at an affordable rent. We want those rights to be robustly implemented. A lot of those rights are coming from recent changes to state law, but the city has a lot of latitude to elaborate on how they are going to implement those state law requirements and enforce those state law requirements. So on the relocation piece, we want to make sure that relocation payments are enough that if a low-income tenant is displaced, they need to get a large enough payment that they can actually find replacement housing in their neighborhood, so that they can stay there long enough to exercise a right to return and return back to their old unit or their old property at an affordable rent. Right now, most tenants in the city of LA are covered by the rent stabilization ordinance, and nearly everybody is. If you're not covered by the rent stabilization ordinance, you're probably covered by the just cause ordinance. So tenants already have a right to relocation under those laws. But a lot of times this could be maybe like $10,000, could be $20,000, or a little bit higher if the tenant's been there for a long time. That sounds like a lot of money, but if you're moving out and you're seeing like a $2,000 a month rent differential between what you were paying and what you have to pay to get an apartment in your neighborhood, $20,000 is going to go real fast if your rent just went up by $2,000 a month. So we really need to increase those relocation amounts so that people can actually get comparable replacement housing in their neighborhood and stay there until they can exercise the right to return. The most recent draft does seem to have a much better sort of streamlined relocation a scheme in it that would give tenants quite a bit more assistance. And this is mainly for low income tenants. The other important piece here is that we need to, like, the city needs to be enforcing these laws, but the city can't be the only one with the power to enforce it. We also need to have a private right of action, so that if a developer skirts one of these requirements, a tenant could sue, or like an organizing group could sue directly, and try to enforce their rights directly through a private right of action. And of course, there needs to be penalties too, right? So if a developer is caught trying to skirt a legal requirement, they need to make the tenant whole and pay a penalty so we can discourage that kind of behavior. We're optimistic that a lot of these things might be in the most recent draft. We're still reviewing it, but these are some of the key points that we're looking for. The resident protection ordinance also is adding new pieces to try and make it feels like a little bit of an odd spot to put it, but it sort of makes sense. The resident protection ordinance is going to have some new requirements around including new affordable units in a registry, like a sort of one-stop shop registry of affordable units. And we think this is a good idea. We think it needs to go a bit further. The idea being that we really want to make sure that when new projects are happening in a neighborhood, those neighborhood residents know how, if they're low-income residents, they know how to apply for the affordable units. We want there to be sort of culturally appropriate outreach that the developer has to facilitate, so that outreach is done in the correct languages, and with some in a culturally appropriate way, so that low-income neighborhood residents can really get access to new affordable units, and that's something that could be added to the RPO as well. The next batch of recommendations on the next slide is around the unit replacement. So under state law, there is a requirement that if a RSO unit or a unit that was occupied by a low-income household is demolished for a new housing project, that unit needs to be replaced with an affordable unit. But we've really learned some lessons from those existing replacement policies, and from the TOC program. The TOC program built many thousands of affordable units, but sometimes it would also lead to projects where the number of units that were demolished, and thanks God for, the TOC is the Transit Oriented Communities Program, which was a program that was Measure JJJ, close some loopholes in the zoning code and require the planning to set up a program to allow housing near transit with affordability requirements and replacement obligations. TOC has, like I was saying, it's led to many thousands of affordable units. Sometimes a TOC project will move forward where the number of units it demolished, or rather the number of affordable units it built was not that much more than the number of units it demolished. Maybe there were 8 RSO units there, and the new project only has 8 or 9 or 10 affordable units. And so we know we can do better than that. We basically want to make sure that there's a that new projects, we're always getting sort of significant increases in affordable units. If we're losing 8 RSO units, we don't just want to get 8 affordable units. We really want there to be significant gains, and we also want to steer developers away from parcels that have a lot of RSO units. So the recommendations we have here are, there's 2 recommendations. So we need to do more than just a 1-for-1 replacement. If 1 RSO unit is demolished, we need more than 1 affordable unit to replace it. Our recommendation is 2. If you're demolishing an RSO unit, you need to replace it with at least 2 affordable units. The second thing is, those replacement units should not count towards the affordability requirement in the incentive. Marissa is going to get into this a little bit more, but the way these incentive programs work is the developer includes affordable units at the site, and in exchange for having affordable units at the site, they get to build a much larger project. One of the problems that we've seen is that when a developer is satisfying their replacement obligation, they also get to count those units towards their affordability set aside. And that can mean that the replacement obligation doesn't necessarily result in more units than if it were a vacant lot or a commercial building, because the developer would have had to do that many units anyways to meet the set aside requirement. So, maybe the set aside requirement might be 12% of the total units. They're building a 100 unit building. Okay, that's 12 affordable units. And if the replacement obligation was 8 or 9 or 10 units, that replacement obligation is not increasing the affordable units at all. So we want to make sure we're doing more than 1-for-1. So we want a 2-for-1 replacement, and we don't want those replacement units to count towards the set aside units. So that if RSO units are destroyed, we're always going to be getting a lot more affordable units. And we think that by really cranking up these replacement requirements, it will steer developers away from sites that have a lot of RSO housing on them. And I think the next slide is Marissa.
Okay, thanks, Greg. So I'm going to highlight 2 changes that we're pushing for in the CHIP. So in terms of the housing incentive program, broadly, we're really pushing for the most affordability and also for the deepest affordability within these incentive programs. So what I mean by most and deepest, if you look at this chart, for example, the one on the bottom, this is an example of what city planning sort of calls menus that developers would have to, that they would have available to choose from. So for example, a developer who wants to build with the CHIP incentive in a moderate or lower income or moderate or lower opportunity area, they would have to provide 4% of those units as extremely low income, ELI, and then 8% as VLI, very low income. So that's the affordability they would have to provide in order to get all of the benefits from the incentive. I will note that these numbers and sort of the amount of affordability has increased with the newer drafts that have come out. So that's something we're happy to see. We're still interested in pushing for as much affordability as is financially feasible to get these projects off the ground. And I will note one very specific demand. You can see from this table that acutely low income only appears in the higher opportunity areas. We do think that that very affordable level should appear everywhere, so in all of the menus. And Godfrey, do you have the page with sort of the income levels? because we use a lot of these, they're sort of like broadly,
Yes.
thank you. There's like
I
moderate
just put it on
housing.
the slide. I just put it on the deck, but I will also share it on screen.
Thank you. Yeah, when we talk about affordable housing, that's sort of like one metric. But LAHD and the state have these sort of other tables that they use. So in addition to there just being low income housing, there are units categorized for someone who is ELI, extremely low income. There's VLI, very low income. ALI is the deepest level of affordability that's provided in these incentives. It actually doesn't appear on this table, but it would be appropriate for example, a single individual who made under $20,000. So across the board, ACT-LA is pushing for more affordability. We think we need more of all of these levels, but we do see sort of a disproportionate lack with the most affordable units. And so we're specifically asking city planning to bump up those levels as much as is financially feasible. And then I think we can go back and look at the next slide. So in addition to more affordability, deep affordability, we're looking for the incentive programs to apply in single family zones. So in the draft from June, single family zones were completely excluded from the CHIP. So what does that mean? That means that even though the city broadly is tasked with undergoing this really massive rezoning process, there was no application of the incentives to build in single family zones at all. And for context, this map shows in the pink areas that are zoned single family compared to areas that are not. Roughly 74% of usable land that could be used for housing is zoned as single family. So when we talk about not developing in single family zones, it's helpful to remember that we're talking about roughly 25% of the city's land, housing land that we can actually build in. So I like to think of this as having two big repercussions. The first is just viability of getting the number of units we need. So, frankly, if the city decides to pass over 74% of our housing land and say, we're not going to build there, the path to meeting these goals feels very bleak. And then on top of that, if we're exempting single family zones, we also have to understand that all of the development that we're talking about that now needs to happen as mandated by the state, all of that development will get pushed into roughly 25% of the city. So instead of being spread out in a way that would cause sort of less disruption, less of a sudden burden, the impacts will be much more dramatic. And so, before this, Greg was talking about protections that we need for renters, and what happens when people get displaced and they're pushed from their homes, from their neighborhoods. So the work of easing those burdens, will become much harder when we're seeing such a strong concentration of building only in 25% of our land. So, expanding these incentives to single family zones, we don't see that as the complete policy solution, but we do see it as a really important step to kind of opening those areas up. And I think you can move to the next slide. So those have been a few of our priorities that we've been focusing on. The full letter does have, all of our demands, and we are going to be updating that in the coming days based on the new updated ordinances. But I just wanted to quickly highlight, a lot of this year, the ACT-LA Coalition has dedicated time first to developing those policy recommendations. We've been meeting our members with City Planning Department, with council members, even though the ordinances haven't formally gone to council. We know that they will. We'd like council members to be champions for specific demands and for equitable development. And then we've also hosted events to bring community voices more directly to city officials. So a couple of these pictures, like this picture on the left is a clipping from a local Korean language newspaper. And they did a feature on Kiwa, who hosted this in-person event. They had 30 local Korean-speaking members give comment at a feedback session for these ordinances back in July. And then other members like SAGE have held asambleas. They've had info sessions to hear from community members about what kind of changes they want to see in their communities, and then figure out how we can push for those through the ordinances. So there's been a lot of mobilizing with our members, with our organizations. And now we're sort of expanding this push more broadly as we're taking it to City Planning Commission. And I think with that, Godfrey, I'm going to hand it back to you to sort of talk about what's next and what are we doing in the immediate.
Yes. Thank you so much, Greg and Marissa, for walking us through that. I often get a chance to sit in meetings that are very policy in the weeds focused, and that's like some of the clearest that I've heard it, and glad we have it videotaped as well to be able to share with the world, because we need to be as clear as possible about how this policy will help us as community members who are not often in housing policy spaces. I know there are 24 folks on this call and many more who will see this video once we distribute it. And you are just some of the hundreds of people who have engaged in this process along the way. As Marissa mentioned, there's been a lot of mobilization, a lot of engagement happening over the many last few months in preparation for all of this. So now it's time to take action, right? Like if we have some understanding of the things we can be pushing for deeper affordability, more affordability in more places for all of our communities, and just stronger protections overall, here are things that you can do to help. So we know that our target is September 26th is the day of the City Planning Commission meeting. That'll be at 8:30 a.m. In advance of that, what we want for everybody to do is to use ACT LA's one-click tool. Basically, it's a website. If someone could put it in the chat box, that would be great. Literally, what it looks like is you go to this website, ActLA/one-click, and I'm gonna put it in the chat box now. And when you go there, literally you see this thing that says click to email. You click on that. And on your computer, if you've programmed it to open up a mail client, an email client, it'll open up an email to the housing element email address, as well as a couple of very specific folks as well, CC'd to that, with some sample text underneath it. Now on my computer, when I click it, I haven't programmed my computer to pop open an email client. You can see like nothing happens. However, on my phone, when I click it, my Outlook thing, or not my Outlook thing, but my like my Gmail or whatever, like opens on there. So try your phone if it doesn't work on your desktop. Either way, this will get you an opportunity to send a pre-prepared email to a variety of different people, uplifting ACT LA's demands that you heard about today. So super easy. Shout out to ACT LA for readying that, and it'll uplift a letter, right? Like the letter that Marissa and Greg have been sharing throughout this conversation. The second thing we want folks to do is to sign up to come or do something on September 26th. So when you go to this next Google form, you'll see that has the address. The address is City Hall. We're going to City Hall. If you know what that looks like, you've been there. It's the same place where you might attend city council meetings. So the City Planning Commission will meet there on the morning of the 26th. Shout out for anybody who brings coffee or whatever, pastries, etc. Like, let's be graceful to ourselves, but also let's show up for action. And so what you'll see is you'll share your name, your contact email, whether you're representing an organization, individual. Spread this far and wide, like let's pack the house. We know who shows up to influence affordable housing development in the city, and it's often folks who don't want affordable housing in their neighborhoods. And so we have to step toe-to-toe with folks and be there. Someone DM'd me and said there will be coffee and pastries. So if come ready for that. But you can see that amongst your choices for participating is, clearly we want people there in person. When the agenda gets released, there will also be a Zoom as well. But you know, we know that folks have just like different accessibility needs and or like may not be able to make it downtown. But if you are able to make it downtown, I think there are going to be people there literally as early as 7:45 or 8 to be able to make sure that like folks are greeted, welcomed, etc. And signing up for comment. And again, you can use the one-click email to make sure that you're emailing folks at the City Planning Commission. So those are two initial steps that folks can take. Yay, I will be there too, Tressa. Those are two initial steps that folks can take. And you can keep up with folks on social media, right? ACT LA is here, LA Forward is here, Public Council is here, as well as many other groups that you all represent to amplify all of this that is happening September 26th. Again, this is just step one. We got to be there step one to make sure the recommendations are good. But then the good recommendations, we need to keep good because the Plum Committee, Planning, Land Use Management, or City Council can tinker with things if they want to, right? And so we have to hold accountable all of our electeds as well as our folks on City Planning Commission to what's good. And we have to push them to make the things that are less good better. So we have this opportunity September 26th through October, November, all the way until these ordinances get signed into law February 12th to reshape the way that we build affordable housing and protect tenants while we are building affordable housing here in LA City. So, you know, that concludes sort of like the teach-in portion of what's happening next week, but we do have time now for us to have Q&A. We're going to stop the recording here, see if you could stop the recording so that if